This year came dreadful forewarnings over the land of the Northumbrians, terrifying the people most woefully. These were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. These tremendous tokens were soon followed by a great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January in the same year, the harrowing inroads of heathen men made lamentable havoc in the Church of God in Holy Island by rapine and slaughter. Thus the entry for the year 793 goes in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, giving us our first recorded glimpse of the Viking raid at Lindisfarne Priory. This video contains some short clips and still photos of my recent trip to Lindisfarne Priory in the north of England, very near the border with Scotland. It is important for Viking history because the entry I just read is one of the earliest notable and documented attacks perpetrated by Vikings on a monastery. It often marks the beginning of what historians call the Viking Age, which spanned from the late 8th century to around 1100 CE. As a geographical feature, Lindisfarne Island is also known as Holy Island, for obvious reasons. Lindisfarne Priory was an isolated Catholic monastic institution founded in the early 7th century on the island when King Oswald of Northumbria granted the land to an Irish monk named Aidan, specifically for the founding of the monastery there. 40 years later, inspired by Aidan's work there, a monk named Cuthbert joined Lindisfarne and changed the history of the place forever. He became the bishop there in 685 until his death a couple of years later in 687. And then, famously, 11 years after his death, his tomb was reopened and his body remained intact and completely undecayed. And so for believers at the time, this was a clear sign of Cuthbert's holiness, and henceforth he became known as Saint Cuthbert. People began to venerate his relics, or his remains, and he eventually became known as one of England's most important Catholic saints. Here on Priory grounds is the statue commemorating Saint Aidan, who was the founder of Lindisfarne Priory in the year 635. He was an Irish monk responsible for converting many Anglo-Saxons to Catholic Christianity until his death in 651. His name in Gaelic means little fire, and for many he's considered one of the patron saints of firefighters. Next up, I have some live clips shot during my visit to the Priory. These are very amateur productions shot simply with an iPhone, and also you'll note the wind is a little bit loud, but nevertheless, I wanted to give you a sense of place. Greetings from the north of England, and so this is Lindisfarne Priory. This is the place that in 793 AD Vikings famously raided, though it wasn't their first time raiding here. They had been here a few years earlier, but this is the most well-known recorded example of Vikings coming ashore and raiding. And if you turn around, you'll be able to see the North Sea straight out here, just on the other side of this little rocky outcropping that we are standing on. And so it would have been easy for Vikings to pull up their ships in the same way that these boats are docked out here and come easily on shore, especially when the tide is out, as it is now. This is a tidally influenced area, and so even when you visit today, you can only come during certain hours because the access way, the roadway to get out here, is flooded with water during certain hours of the day. And so it is very isolated, as monasteries were by intention, but now a Viking could come up easily on the beach and just scramble up over this little hill right here, and you see we have the ruins of the Priory, which is the monastic center that was housed beginning in the early 600s and all the way off and on until the early 1500s, when it was dissolved by Henry VIII, the King of England, who got rid of all of the Catholic monasteries in the land at that time. This 58-second clip is of our drive out to Lindisfarne on Holy Island. I mentioned in the previous clip that the island is isolated and influenced by the tides. There was a 6-hour window on the day I visited during which the road you see was clear and not underwater. When the tide is out, you can get to the island, but when it is in, the road is completely submerged. Many travelers don't heed the warnings and get stuck on the island until the tide recedes again. Luckily, that didn't happen to us. This is the south, as you see the boats out there. And I mentioned Vikings could easily pull their boats up and come across and up this little hill here and end up sacking the monastery just over the other side of the hill. But if we pan around and think of where Scandinavia is relative to this, they also could have come from the north-northeast. And that direction, as you see, the tide is out and there's quite a natural harbor right here. And so the natural harbor would also have been a place where they could bring boats up easily and then hit the monastery from this side on the north. The ruins of the priory that you see here are monastic buildings that existed over various periods of time. There are no remains that go back to the 8th century when Vikings would have first shown up. This actually looks like a larger monastery, even though it was classified in the 16th century as some of the smaller monasteries by the time Henry VIII dissolved it. And so that means only a handful of monks probably lived here at the very end. And that's probably true for much of its life. Even though it was a pretty major pilgrimage center, people came from all over the north of England to worship here and to pay homage to the saint, the priory saint, St. Cuthbert, who is now buried in Durham Cathedral, just a bit south of here. So we don't know what it looked like when Vikings came here in the 8th century, but it's probably a fair bet that it was much smaller than what you see now. This color-coded diagram gives you a good sense of the layout from the 12th to 14th centuries. You'll note, as I mentioned in my video clip, that there are no surviving ruins from the late 8th century when the Vikings first attacked. But the priory was always on this site, and the diagram shows you a typical layout for a moderate-sized monastery with various buildings and rooms for performing various functions needed to sustain the community. In the next slide, you'll see a recreation rendering to give you even more of an idea for how the priory likely appeared. Isolated monasteries were intended to be entirely self-sustaining communities. This drawing shows Lindisfarne as a modest monastery. The priory was known as an important pilgrimage site, drawing many people to it, as indeed it still does today. But even still, it was not a large institution. As I mentioned in my video clip, it was considered one of the smaller houses at the time it was dissolved under the command of King Henry VIII, who eliminated all monasteries in England in the 16th century, which meant it generated under 200 English pounds sterling per year. Even though we don't have excavated building ruins of the priory at the time the Vikings initially invaded in the 8th century, we do have this stone, which has been interpreted as a grave marker, and it was found at Lindisfarne and has become known as the Viking Doomsday Stone. It dates to the 9th century and is believed to depict 7 Viking warriors who are brandishing swords and axes and have the cut marks across their body which resemble chainmail. This is one of the only surviving pieces of evidence in stone that we have of the Viking attacks at the priory. The stone is now displayed in the Priory Site Museum. What follows are a few still photos of the priory ruins. I hope you've enjoyed this mini tour of Lindisfarne Priory. It was definitely a dream come true to finally be there. I'm ending on this photo because it perfectly sums up what makes me happy and inspires me not only as a historian but as a person. The fact that I appear small is a perfect metaphor because standing in an ancient ruin thinking about all the people and all the stories that have occurred there inspires so much awe and humility in the face of our immense and fascinating human story. I am so grateful to have the opportunity to share the experience with you here. Thanks for watching!